So welcome to Last Stand's Keys in the Balance. This is the topic being covered tonight is preservation, historic preservation within the historic district or even in other areas, as opposed to going green, which doesn't have to be a conflict. You know, that's what we'll discuss tonight. And I'm going to just jump right into it and start, and I'm going to one by one, I'm going to introduce our panel and ask them their first question. So some of these people won't be introduced for close to a half an hour from now after the others have spoken, but we'll start on the far end of the table with Victor Cushman. Victor Cushman is an engineering graduate from Columbia University of New York. He went to work at DuPont Corporation and did some of his stints even in Europe during those days. In the early 80s, he moved to Key West, ostensibly to retire, but he says that since then he's worked harder than ever, much of it in renovating houses. He's also a member of GLEE. He's a volunteer teacher with Literacy Volunteers of America, a volunteer mentor with Take Stock in Children. And Victor founded the Serenity House on Emma Street, which is a facility that gives a second chance to people who are down on their luck to start up in a clean and decent housing. It welcomes recovering alcoholics, and each resident is self-supporting through their own contributions, and it takes no government money. Recently, Victor founded the Key West White Roofs Initiative and applied white roof coatings to the Serenity House without HARC approval. Subsequently, the Key West Magistrate Jeff Overby ruled that HARC should allow such coatings. I'm going to ask him his initial question now, which is, what benefits have you observed by your introduction of white cool roof technologies to your properties, and do you see any drawbacks to rapid adoption by others in Key West?
Thank you, David.
5 minutes to answer.
Well, some of you have this picture in your hand. The first benefit of the cool roof technology is that it's pretty. By the way, you'll see on the wall we use the same material because it makes great paint, and it also reduces. We have quite a sun load on this wall. Also reduces heat and energy on that wall. The second reason to go about it is that it saves money. In one of my buildings, which was one of the pre-Civil War buildings, and you know how well they were insulated, the electric bill through that whole series of steps that's written on one of these pages was 27%. So that's $3,000 a year savings. And another building got 12%. That was a more modern building, already well insulated. And the third one, actually, we lost 4% because we had stuck a whole bunch of new computers and observation equipment in there, security equipment. So, but we understood the additional workload of having 3 computers running full steel building. So I figure the break-even point for us of covering all that expense is about a year and a half, whereas with Chad will tell us electrical systems break even in 30 or 40 years, something like that, and hot water systems solar hot water systems break even in a year and a half, 2 years, if I get it right, Chad.
Sometimes
A little longer, maybe? Okay. So, it's been a tough year. We needed to save the money. Third thing is, obviously, it's beneficial to the environment. According to, I talked to the CES guy who helped Annalisa with the study, and he said, basically, the majority of our energy comes from coal sources up around Disney World. The quick and simple rule of thumb, without going through the whole web distribution thing, is 1 kilowatt saved is 1.5 pounds worth of CO2 emissions saved. So just by that one little work there, we saved 75 tons. Now, the city needs a whole lot more than that, but hey, we did our bit. We got 75 tons reduction. This is ready to go across the board. You will see on the back of all of the conservation spec sheet an offer that I made to the city. The White Roofs Initiative offers to paint city buildings roofs white at no charge to the city in exchange for half the savings for the first 10 years. After that, it's all there. Now, I believe there's enough savings in it to pay for that and still provide a profit. This is what we're talking about. That's the gray Harper. It reflects 58% of the light it hits it. It contains this solvent. This is the solvents and binders that are on the top of the bucket of the silver paint that silver was drunk. And so you got this much black within the material, which obviously is black and short. The more modern solution, here's raw V-groove, but this is a new material. This one's 92% reflective. And so that translated for an average structure of average insulation, maybe 15%. To District 6 housing, where we can't have poor people and rotten insulation, there's more to be had there, like we got. So the only restriction about applying this across the city is A, city politicians who have not got on board yet, and B, we have, despite national policy and despite city laws and despite the city commissioner's resolution in favor of reviving building codes and these technologies, we have a HARP organization which does not cooperate. However, Jeb and John have made the first inroads to enforce our solar rights, and we're so glad for their services.
Thank you for that. And now we're going to move to this end of the table and for a counterpoint from that, and I'm going to introduce Barbara Bowers. Barbara has degrees in art history and social and behavioral sciences from St. Louis and Webster Universities. She's been a teacher, a writer, an artist, and has held executive roles. She's traveled extensively throughout the Caribbean and elsewhere. She's lived in the Keys since the mid-'80s and has become familiar enough with local architecture and real estate to write weekly news features on Keys homes and to host regular radio shows covering anything pertinent to Keys housing. After acquiring and renovating an 160-year-old apartment compound in Old Town, she dove deeply enough into historic restoration issues to be named to the Historic Architectural Review Commission, which is also known as HARC, where she served until earlier this year. During her time on the HARC board, Barbara was selected to be chairperson of the board, and she joins us here tonight to speak from a HARC perspective because the HARC members couldn't make it. So the question for Barbara is, some say that historically Key West buildings have changed to meet new challenges. What's the rationale for avoiding changes now in the historic district?
And I would say that buildings are still changing from the early sawtooths that enlarged as families enlarged. They build on another little back part of the house, to swimming pools, to energy-saving devices. There is no rationale for avoiding changes, and HARC is not doing that. It's HARC's job to ensure the changes are made compatibly with preservation of Key West's unique architectural heritage, because preservation is a public purpose that benefits the educational, cultural, and economic welfare of all of our residents. The sawtooth additions to houses was something that we saw very early on in the 1800s. After a little house was built, another little section would be built on. Hark still approves those additions. Wood roofs turned into tin roofs after the Great Fire in 1886. You know, there was no Hark issue at that time. Electricity came into being in the early 1900s, and so the houses continued to evolve. AC hit us in the 1950s. In 1963, the Florida legislature granted Key West authority to create an architectural review commission, which ultimately became the Hark Board in 1986. So it went through some evolution to become what you know now as the Historic Architectural Review Commission. In that year, in 1986, the Secretary of the Interior Standards and Guidelines were adopted by city ordinance, and Hark guidelines established how the changes and the reuse of existing materials were to be done without altering the characteristics of the historic buildings. Solar panels were approved when I was on the board in the 2000s. Atlantic Shores, which is now part of the southernmost group, had solar panels approved by the Hark Commission. I believe the Banyan had its solar panels approved by the Hark Commission when I was on it. It's been doing this. So the constant changing is happening within the district now. So there is no avoiding the changes. What Jeff Overby, our special magistrate, did recently was clarify a problem that has been existing within Florida. And I talked to him about this, so this is his quote. Florida statutes loosely interpret energy-saving devices. So what he did to, complement, I guess, Hark's position on solar or any energy-saving devices was that he became specific by ruling that roof treatments fall into the realm of energy-saving devices. But he said that Hark has the power to decide what color those roofs might be. Hark has already had the power to decide where solar panels could be placed, and it's all written up. Even now, this is in the Historic Architectural Review, within the Historic Architectural Guidelines. New technologies are evolving. White paint or heat-reflected paint, additives like Insulite. You know, there's grass roofs on this building. We have grass roofs. Claims are still at odds. How much is being saved? I think that it's wonderful that that Victor's saved 27% on one building and 12% on another. Do we dismantle the historic district for a 12% savings that might be saved in some other form? Buildings consume 68% of the electricity produced in the United States, and in Key West, that energy consumption is primarily air conditioning. We all suffer through those power outages, so you know when the peak moments are in the summer. So what we want to do is, of course, conserve our cool interiors with roof treatments that could be on the underside of the roofs in the form of insulation in your attics, or it can be on the top of the roofs. We can turn off our air conditioning during the heat of the day if we want to save electric costs at our homes. Or we can just plain old blow-off air conditioning the way many of the people do in this town. Many people who I've written about their homes because these houses have been built so well to handle airflow. We can use shutters. We can put film on our windows that will reflect the sunlight as well. We can plant trees. There are any number of ways to save the energy and to cool the interior of our houses. If we want to save the planet, we need to stop Duval Street's open doors policy. We need to give business owners an incentive to contain their air conditioning, and we'll do a lot more to help with the electric issues in the Keys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to drop down to the other end again, and next we'll talk about Jed Rigante. I assume I'm pronouncing that right.
You are.
Okay, I've been known you for a while, but I'm not sure. Anyway, Jed is a University of Florida Law School graduate with honors who came to the Keys to practice civil law, but his local experience brought him exposure to environmental law also. After subsequent sojourns in political campaign management and as a lobbyist, he took a break from the law and became a local businessman. He and his wife, Christine, opened a green consulting firm, Economic Solutions, and have been involved in many local solar energy projects. He has since teamed up with a local builder in a joint venture focusing on green development. Jed has served as a board member for GLEE. He's been a member of at least a dozen local and national nonprofits that defend the environment. And he served as the chairman of Monroe County Green Initiatives Task Force. He also serves as chairman of Helpline and executive director of Southernmost Sustainability Community Development Corporation. And recently, his team has challenged TARC's guidelines for installation of solar technology and expects a ruling from the magistrate on that issue soon. So the question for Jed is, with your legal background, can you provide a basic background of the laws and interpretations of them that apply to adoption of green technologies in Florida? And I know this is a very broad topic, so please focus on those that are more at play locally.
Thank you, David, and thank you all for being here. I want to thank Last Stand for the opportunity to talk about these things. Thanks, Vic. I think I have this memorized by now. This is the law that is probably the most influential over the installation of green energy devices, if you'd like to call them that, is a statute known as 16304. Florida Statute 16304 began as Florida's right to dry law, which there was a period where we went, as we developed in Florida, a lot, you've noticed, maybe not so much in Key West, but you have communities throughout the state that are closed communities with deed restrictions, where you can't put a clothesline in your front yard if the housing, the HOA or the Community Development Association says you can't. This is how that law started, was to free up people the ability to dry their clothes using the original solar thermal heat source, the sun. That law was enacted by our legislature in 1980. Subsequent, it went through several revisions as lawyers challenged the law and or used the law to apply it to different technologies. Now solar collectors are specifically mentioned in that law, as are other energy saving devices, which is where the white roofs come in. The actual language of the statute is and it has, you have to think of it in two different ways. The law applies both to local governments and it applies to homeowners associations. So there are two different entities to whom this law applies. Originally, it did not apply to homeowners associations. That had to be added later because HOAs were preventing people from installing these devices. But the essential provision for local governments is that the local government may not enact any ordinance and as a governing body, and that can be the city commission or any subsidiary of the city commission that would have the power to enact, like a planning board. They are also regulated by that. That issue has been disposed of in the state of Florida. So anything that flows from local government, whether it be county or city, mosquito control district, school board, all of those things would be considered under the purview of the statute. You cannot make a law that prevents a homeowner or a business from installing solar collectors, clotheslines, or other energy devices based on renewable resources. It's expressly prohibited by the statute. And the important language in this is it says, notwithstanding any provision of this chapter or any other provision of the general law, which means this trumps. If there's another state law that says you can't do it, for instance, the building code, sorry, you lose. 16304 says notwithstanding any other provision of state law. That is very important language in this. It gives homeowners and business people their Fifth Amendment rights to life, liberty, and property, to do with their property what is the responsible thing to do, and to allow themselves to not only save the environment, but to save money. So the second part of the statute deals with deed restrictions. In real property law, if you move into a community that has an HOA and they have a deed restriction on your property, it means you bought the property knowing you couldn't do something. And in this case, these deed restrictions would deal with solar devices. Let's say you move into an HOA, a homeowners association, a deed restricted plot that says you can't put solar collectors on your house. Well, this law right here says that that deed restriction, and deed restrictions in the law are one of the most sacrosanct areas of law. Deed restrictions are designed to prevent people from doing with their property things that their neighbors wouldn't approve of. Even deed restrictions have been specifically singled out by the legislature to be overridden by this statute 16304. It gives those people in those communities the right to install clotheslines, to install other energy devices, white roofs for instance, or one of the more prevalent, for some reason, one of the more prevalent items that keeps coming up in the cases are solar skylights, solar tubes and skylights to light your house using natural light, not electric light. So that is probably the most significant statute that exists for homeowners. And there are many areas in which this law can be applied to guidelines such as HARC's guidelines. Yes, HARC has a guideline, but their guideline, in my opinion and the opinion of the judge, Judge Overby as a special magistrate, cannot prevent you from putting solar panels on your roof, even if they are visible from the public right-of-way.
We'll get a chance to discuss all this stuff more as we go. Right now, these are the individual questions, and there will be time for the audience to ask questions a little later. Okay, and so the next, we're jumping back to this side, and we'll talk about Bert Bender. So Bert has an architectural degree from the University of Illinois, and he subsequently went to Arizona to work with the acclaimed visionary architect Paolo Solieri. He was the originator of the concept of arcology, which is the melding of architecture and ecology. Bert has practiced sustainable design and historic preservation for 35 years, including such projects as the Flagstaff City Hall, which is a 50,000 square foot passive solar building. Other more local things like the FKCC campus, the restoration of our Customs House and the Gatto building, and many other projects. He's a member of the National Florida Trust for Historic Preservation. He's a member of the Old Island Restoration Foundation, the Historic Florida Keys Foundation, the Nature Conservancy, and among many other organizations. Bert is also a past member of the HARC Board. Question for Bert. As a lot of people see historic preservation and green technology in buildings as an either-or situation, how is it possible to reconcile the apparently conflicting principles?
The principles are not conflicting. The sustainable movement and historic preservation are compatible concepts. There were two documents that I left to be handed out. And this document has information from a presentation that I made to the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation concerning the application of LEED standards to historic buildings. Much of the information in here came from a report that we prepared for the State Division of Historic Resources called Sustainable Stewardship, the Environmental Benefits of Historic Preservation in Florida. And that report focused on the application of LEED to historic resources. If you're not familiar with LEED, it's considered to be the gold standard in sustainable design. The other thing that's handed out is a page from the Florida Building Code and also from the Secretary of the Interior's guidelines, which discusses the application of energy-saving devices to historic properties. The concepts contained within the Secretary of the Interior standards and LEED are compatible as expressed in their respective mottos: identify, retain, and preserve. The guidance that is basic to the treatment of all historic buildings, identifying, retaining, and preserving the form and detailing of those architectural materials and features that are important in defining the historic character. This statement is the central principle behind a successful historic rehabilitation, as stated in the Secretary of the Interior's guidelines for rehabilitating historic structures. Reduce, reuse, and recycle. the guidance that is basic to all aspects of the sustainable movement and as related to preservation, reducing energy and waste, reusing buildings and materials, and recycling construction waste or demolished fabric. The guiding principles that are central to historic preservation are central to the sustainable movement in general and LEED in particular. Both encourage preservation of the historic building, both encourage reuse of materials, both encourage removal of non-compatible and or hazardous materials, both reduce the need for energy use. In this document are 5 principles for sustainable preservation. I won't go through them all in detail. Number 1 is repair rather than replace at every scale. The second one, learn from the past, rediscover and redeploy the original green features. Many historic buildings were green when they were constructed. They were designed and constructed before we had air conditioning or other energy-using devices. If you go back to restoring the building, the features that were inherently sustainable to those buildings will then be recaptured and become energy-saving devices again. Communication with your regulatory officials, incentives and grants. There are incentives and grants for both sustainable architecture, sustainable features such as solar panels, and there are grants available for historic preservation. You can leverage those to attain all of the issues that you need in any project. The other things that are in this document, and again, I won't go through those for the sake of time, but there are 3 pages in here that identify the 10 standards. There are also on 2 columns. One column is compatible LEED credits with that standard. The other side is credits which have a potential conflict. If you go through the list, you're going to find out that there are very few LEED credits that have a potential conflict with historic properties. It's all in how you execute it. And if you go to standard number 9, which is new additions, exterior alterations, or related new construction, you'll see that all of the LEED standards are applicable to that. There's another page in here, which on a slide projector is much easier to see. The photograph on the lower right-hand corner is the Leach Mansion. The building was designed during the Depression era in the 1930s. If you look closely at that building, you're going to see there are 2 solar panels on it. They were installed in the 1930s. They heated water for the mansion. Above that photograph, you're going to see an advertisement for a solar water heater. The advertisement, you'll note that they had a price reduction. Apparently they had a recession, but in 1892, they reduced the price to $15 net. The retail price of the solar collectors and solar panels were $25. You're going to see that on the left here is a contemporary advertisement for passive solar devices for heating and for electricity. It's very similar. The other pages that are included in this handout have a number of projects which are LEED certified, historic registered properties. They're all LEED certified projects, and you can see by going through that list that the concepts contained within LEED and within the Secretary of the Interior standards are compatible. And I think my time's up, isn't it, David?
Thank you.